What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to get right on into the response that we're going to be doing, and that's going to be to Capturing Christianity, or Cameron Bertuzzi. He is going to be defending God against divine hiddenness, or rather telling us why divine hiddenness really isn't a problem because of the Bible or something. And apparently it's supposed to make us believe in God more, this hiddenness that seems to be plaguing God. So we're going to be reviewing Cameron's case for that. If you heathens want to fuck around and find out how wrong Cameron Bertuzzi is on the divine hiddenness problem, then please stay tuned. Anyways, we're going to go on ahead, get right on into the video here. So we got the divine hiddenness problem. What is the divine hiddenness problem? Well, the problem with divine hiddenness is that God is just not detectable. I won't say that he's not seen, like we don't see God or anything like that. God is not detectable in any kind of unbiased way. Like, you know, people claim to have experiences of God, which is nice, I guess, but they're not really, that's not really a detectable way that we can perceive God. And because we cannot perceive or detect God, it makes no sense to like believe in that God. Like if we can't detect something, like let's say fluffy nurple pumps, whatever those might be. If there's like if we can't detect that those things exist in any kind of fashion, if they have no effect on our reality as far as we can perceive it, then why would you believe that thing? And so that's the problem that a lot of skeptical people have, a lot of atheists have with the God of the Bible or any particular definition of God. It's not particularly useful against the general idea of God, because like a general idea of God would be some deity that exists out there and it doesn't necessarily have to interact with our reality. It's just some deity that exists, wherever in the hell. And so if it has, no direct impact on our reality, or maybe not even just our reality, let's just say it doesn't have any direct impact on our world, like our particular area of the vast universe, let's just say that there's no effect on it. Why would we believe that he exists there, he exists at all, if we don't have any evidence that suggests that he does exist? And so this is kind of the divine hiddenness problem. And it's one that I have trouble getting past. And I think that until, theists sufficiently overcome it, I don't think that a theistic kind of God is ever going to be really all that, not possible, but plausible. All right, let's get to the divine hiddenness problem and let's see what's going on with it.
Sometimes it seems like God is hiding from us. Believers often lack a sense of guidance from God when it comes to important decisions, don't get what they request from God, and lack a sense of God's presence in difficult times.
It's not that like God seems to be absent whenever we ask him for something. Cameron here is trying to make it out to be like a problem with us asking God for something, or like a believer that's asking God for something and God seems to be not answering, or just simply not there in some kind of fashion. While that might cause somebody to start questioning whether or not God actually exists, and that leads them further into like really questioning the logic and the claims of like Christianity, I don't think that should cause you to stop believing in God. Like I think that if you're sitting there noticing that when you pray for something and God doesn't answer, you don't feel God's presence anymore or anything like that, I think that's a good opportunity for you to further question like what you believe, why you believe it. I don't think that this should cause anybody to just immediately stop believing in God. I feel like that would be a little bit hasty at that point. I think that you really need to, investigate the reasons why you still believe in a God. He's kind of putting it up right here like, oh, well, this right here is the divine hiddenness problem for believers.
Some non-believers think the so-called argument from divine hiddenness is strong evidence against God's existence.
I disagree with this. Cameron is qualifying it appropriately. I think some non-believers think that this is strong evidence against God's existence. I don't think that it's necessarily strong evidence against God's existence. Like, could it be strong evidence against the biblical version of God? Sure. I think that it could definitely be strong evidence against that, because here's the thing about the biblical God, right? The biblical God, up until Jesus, he was very active, in the lives of the Israelites. Now, there were periods of time, like 400 years or something like that, where God seems to be absent, at least as far as the stories go that we have. He's absent, but he's always made his presence known through like prophets and all this other stuff. And of course, now we hear prophets and it's like, oh, what the fuck are you talking about, prophets? You're not a prophet. You're fucking crazy. Go to the loony bin or something. At least that's all the ones that claim to be prophets that appear on Right Wing Watch. That's kind of how I feel about them. I think that it's strong evidence against the biblical God, but I feel like that's the only qualifier here that is missing, that needs to be stated, is that it's not just God's existence. Although Cameron Bertuzzi is very obviously talking about Yahweh, or the biblical God, the Abrahamic version of God. You can make a solid case that he's talking about that kind of God, but generally these very generalized arguments for God can be used by any religion out there in order to prove that at least some kind of God exists. So to say that it's strong evidence against a general God, his existence or their existence, I don't think that that's accurate at all. At least I don't consider divine hiddenness as far as just from the standpoint of a more deistic or just a general God idea. I don't think it's strong evidence against that.
They say God isn't more present because, well, God doesn't exist. Even if hiddenness doesn't cause us to doubt God's existence, it can still leave us confused and hurt. What should we say about this problem?
So what should we say about this problem? Well, if you're honest about this problem, then you will more than likely say that, while I don't have empirical evidence that this God exists, or I don't have any direct way to know that this God exists, I have faith that he exists. But that's still not going to be good enough for anybody that's skeptical of God's existence, or anybody that's really questioning God's existence, because then you could literally believe in anything at that point. Because if you're just going to believe in something because somebody else told you something is true, without having any kind of direct evidence that it is true, then you're opening yourself up to a lot of different things that could not be true, like faith healing. There's no direct evidence that faith healing actually works, but there are still people that believe in it because they have faith. Faith seems to be what you use when you lack direct evidence of it. Although there are people like Cameron Bertuzzi who thinks that he has an evidence-based faith, that because of the evidence he has faith in God. I believe is kind of the tactic that he takes. If not, I apologize to Cameron if I've mistaken him for somebody else. But a lot of times apologists will say that it's evidence-based because they do have arguments for God's existence. It's just that non-believers think that those pieces of evidence don't actually prove the conclusion, or that they're not actually pieces of evidence that support their conclusion. So what should you say about this problem? That this problem exists, and you either have to admit that there's no direct evidence of God, but you still believe in him anyways, or you just have to figure out what we do have evidence for. And as far as what we do have evidence for, everything that we have evidence for, none of it points towards the supernatural existing or a deity existing. So to me, it's like asking, do you want to believe in this fantastical tale even though it's not true, or at least it can't be proven to be true? Do you only want to believe in true things, like things that we know for sure are true? It kind of seems to be the path that you would need to take there. But let's see how Cameron takes it.
It may be helpful to realize that hiddenness isn't a new thing, and it isn't limited to you. In fact, it's biblical. In chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, God promises Abram that his descendants will become a great nation. This promise, however, is not fulfilled for 13 years. By this time, Abram is an old man.
I think it's a little hilarious that Cameron chooses this part right here to highlight as like biblical evidence of divine hiddenness. It's funny to me primarily because this is not evidence of divine hiddenness. If you know the story that goes on here, you would know that God personally appears to Abraham, talks with Abraham, sends his angels. Like there's a trio of angels speaking on behalf of God that talk to Abraham, let him know that Sarah is going to be giving him a kid. And, Sarah laughs and God's like, who the fuck you laughing at? So this is not evidence of divine hiddenness at all. If this is evidence of anything, it's storytelling. But if this were to have actually happened in history, this would be God directly telling somebody, hey, this is going to happen. Just because it doesn't happen for some time doesn't mean that it's all of a sudden God is just like hidden from people or anything like that. The problem with divine hiddenness is that God never shows up for us now, that God never speaks to us now. Of course, you'll have some believers and apologists out there that'll say, God speaks to me all the time. Yeah. One person famously in our community always talks about how God talks to her, even smacking her off of her bike as she's riding down the road. And it seems weird to me to interpret things as God speaking to you. I know I'm speaking from experience here, right? Because I used to think that God spoke to me through just happenstance, like just things that coincidentally happened in my life. I thought that was God talking to me. I thought that was God trying to send a message to me because that's what I had been taught. I had been taught that God doesn't so much directly speak to you in words because for some reason he destroyed his phone up there in heaven and decided not to talk to anybody anymore, but that he would speak to you through common, things that happened during the day. Like if you're walking through the mall and you immediately thought about that one time you got embarrassed and it's like, oh, God's punishing me for that. God's telling me this is bad, or you shouldn't be doing these things, or you're fallen, or you're guilty, or something like that. So, I mean, it's things of that nature that generally I find a lot of people saying that is how God speaks to you. But this is a far cry from what we were experiencing in the Bible. In the Bible, 3 brosefs that one of them is either God, Jesus, or the whole band of merry men there is God, Yahweh, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit, because there's different ways to interpret who the 3 people were that visited Abraham there. We're talking about direct connection. If you think also in the book of Judges with Gideon is directly visited by an angel of the Lord that's bringing the word of God to him. It doesn't even have to be like it. I say that it doesn't have to be God that directly interacts. It could be like these angels that are bringing the word of the Lord or anything like that. I think that would suffice as far as the divine hiddenness problem goes. It would be tough to determine whether or not these things are really angels or whatnot, because we don't have any evidence of angels fucking existing except for the show Supernatural, the movie City of Angels, things of that, like media, like popular entertainment media is like the evidence that you have for angels. But with Gideon, the word of the Lord visits him and says, hey, you're a nerdy fuck, but God has chosen you to, lead his army and everything like that. And so that again is a direct interaction with this supposed God. And so nowhere in the Old Testament can you really point out a story and say, hey, this is divine hiddenness in the Old Testament. Because I can guarantee you at some point in that story, God has revealed himself in some kind of way to these fucks. And the fact is that the divine hiddenness that we're talking about is completely different. God is totally absent. God isn't speaking to us. He's not farting in our faces. He's not doing any shit.
Later on in Genesis, Joseph, an obedient and faithful man of God, found himself sold into slavery, wrongly accused of adultery, and thrown into prison. He was there so long, the Bible says, he was literally forgotten.
So this is a really weird way to paint this story. And I'm so glad that we have the Daily Bible podcast. If you guys don't know, down below in the comment or in the description, we actually have a link to the Daily Bible podcast. It's just dailybiblepodcast.com. You can hit that and you can go and you can hear all the podcasts and everything like that. It's also here on this channel. But going through all of the Old Testament, I know exactly what this story is, and this is not how the Bible describes, this story of Joseph here. So this Joseph is the Joseph in the multicolored jacket guy. He was sold by his brothers into slavery. He eventually made his way to Egypt, and he became a slave of an Egyptian nobleman or master or something like that. And so the nobleman or the master's wife tried to seduce Jacob, and Jacob was like, "No, I do not want this. I am not gonna fuck you," kind of thing. And so, of course, the woman claims that Joseph tries to grape her and is thrown into prison. Now, in prison, the first thing that it says in the Bible is that the Lord was with him. That's all that it says. Now, whether that means he was with him in spirit or however it means for the Lord to be with him, it's not like it says, oh, he was thrown in prison and he was forgotten about. Where the forgotten about part comes is that he's asked to interpret dreams. And when he's asked to interpret dreams, there's some fuck that promises he won't forget about Joseph when, he makes it up somewhere. He makes it up somewhere and he forgets about Joseph. This is not about God forgetting about Joseph. Had the Lord with him the entire time. So I find it rather weird that he paints Joseph as being forgotten, or that there was some kind of divine hiddenness in this story. There was never divine hiddenness in this story. I guess maybe what he's talking about is the fact that Joseph was framed for a crime that he didn't commit and he was thrown in jail. But the problem is that it doesn't say that God was hidden from Joseph. It's just that God allowed some bad shit to happen to Joseph, right? And so maybe that's what Cameron is talking about here, is just that it seems like God is hidden, or it seems like God is hidden from him. But the problem is that Joseph is able to interpret these dreams, or he's given dreams by God or whatever. And, it makes it very obvious that, Joseph never thought that God left him or anything like that, or that God was hidden from Joseph. I mean, it makes it very plain that at least Joseph believed that the Lord was with him the entire time. And that shows when he gets thrown into prison. He gets thrown into prison and he gets elevated up to be basically the prison manager. He was a prisoner that managed all the other prisoners. So he was like head prisoner, I guess. And eventually that gets him into being the right-hand man to Pharaoh, which puts him in a position to have the Israelites enslaved by Egypt. So, it all works out in the end.
And in one of the most astonishing verses in the New Testament, Jesus himself experiences hiddenness on the cross when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
This part right here doesn't make a lot of sense just in the context of the crucifixion. I mean, prior to this, Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he is talking with God, praying to God, and God is speaking back to him about what he is to do. Now, of course, in the different Gospels, you've got different versions of the story with different ways that Jesus comes to terms with what he has to do. I believe this is the Gospel of Mark. Sorry, it's Matthew. Yeah, it's Matthew 27:45. So this particular verse, I believe, only occurs in Matthew. It's different in each Gospel. That's right. Thank you, honey. There's only the one Gospel that has this, but also it doesn't make sense for him to say it because Jesus doesn't think that God has abandoned him necessarily, because God has already communicated yo, Jesus, you need to do me a solid, okay? I'm sorry about this, but you're gonna have to let the Romans pin the Jew on the stick, okay? That's just gonna have to be how it goes, and so you're gonna have to drink from that particular fucking cup, okay? My hands are tied in this situation. Technically, they were nailed, but whatever. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. For one thing, God is in this story of Jesus, God is not hidden. Now, as far as God not doing something to save Jesus, or God not doing something about this is his plan the entire time. how would that make sense for God to then like throw a lightning bolt and get Jesus off of the cross? Like, that defeats the entire purpose of the Jesus story right there. The whole purpose of the Jesus story is to kill Jesus so that our sins could be absolved for some fucking reason. It just doesn't make sense for our sins to be absolved that way, but whatever. God could have easily just changed his mind about sin, but nope, that's not how it works here. But anyways, so this is not an instance of divine hiddenness. This is just an instance of bad storytelling, in my opinion. None of these examples have been divine hiddenness. I think he's talking about whenever we ask God for something or bad shit happens to us and God doesn't do anything about it. That's not exactly divine hiddenness. Divine hiddenness is just the fact that there's no evidence whatsoever that God interacts with our reality. Now, that's a more generalized, that's obviously more generalized than, saying, oh, bad shit happens to me and, God doesn't do anything about it. Regardless of whether or not bad things happen to you or one thing or another, the fact that there's no discernible evidence that God does exist is the divine hiddenness problem. Painting it as if, oh, when you ask for things and God doesn't do shit, he's hidden from you. No, he's not. Not exactly. As far as the issue of divine hiddenness goes, that's not what we're talking about, because God could be there, he's just a dick.
Clearly, being a Christian doesn't exclude us from experiencing spiritual dryness. Coming to grips with the biblical nature of hiddenness is a start, but how might a Christian respond intellectually to hiddenness?
So, okay, before we get into his analogy here, how might a Christian explain hiddenness? I mean, I would think that in my experience, Christians explain it as God isn't hidden. While God may not, directly answer you in the booming voice that he does in the Old Testament, he answers your prayers in different ways. Of course, God could say no and to whatever you're praying for. It's kind of hard when you ask harder questions like, oh, why didn't God stop that priest from raping that child in the rectory? Why didn't God stop that? And that puts people in the uncomfortable position of having to explain why it's a good thing for a child to be raped by a priest, or like that was somehow like God was allowing that to happen, or God allowed it to happen for a good reason. John McRae recently from What Do You Mean, we reviewed his video about why it's a good thing that children get cancer, and he basically said that if God allows it, then there's got to be a good reason for it. So you end up having to put yourself in the uncomfortable position of justifying objectively horrible events and actions that there is no justification for, that makes them good, thinking that God has a reason for this. There's a reason why God didn't stop it or whatever. There's a reason why God allowed it to continue for so long. You'll get people that think that, oh, well, God did eventually stop him. Yeah, after 30 kids, God couldn't get up off his ass faster. Like, it doesn't affect free will for God to pop into existence for 1 millisecond and smack someone in the dick, because that's one of the things that apologists argue with, is that God doesn't want to affect free will. In order to allow free will, then horrible shit does happen. But God doesn't want to take away free will, so horrible shit happens because God loves us so much for some reason. And my point is that when those kind of horrible things happen, God could easily just pop into existence, prevent them from happening in some kind of way, popping somebody in the dick, causing somebody to swerve somewhere, or something like that. I don't know, but he could pop in for a quick second and then pop out, and there's no free will affected. You can think about raping that kid over there, but I'm going to pop in and smack you in the dick every time, kind of situation. Like, that's not affecting free will. They would still be using their free will in order to make those decisions. But then again, you could think, oh, well, if God's in charge of everything, if he's controlling the future, like he knows what's going to happen, why does he create kids that immediately get cancer as soon as they're born, or like soon after they're born? Why does God do those things? Why does God put small children through such horrible, debilitating diseases? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Of course, apologists and Christians would be like, well, there's a good reason why that child had to suffer like that. Like, there's a good reason for it. And it's like, I think that's bullshit.
A good parent wants to develop their relationship with their children as much as they can. They wouldn't let their children think that they were gone, leave them in the dark about what they wanted, or refuse to comfort them in their pain, at least not if they could help it. Shouldn't we expect the same from God?
If you're going to have a relationship as a parental figure, I do think that you would at least need to be there. I think that you would at least, like, you can't just leave a child alone and be like, your parents are really there, even though you can't see them, they're really there, and just leave the child to fend for themselves with parents that just don't exist. I don't feel like this analogy works all that well at all, because generally parents are always there. And, if a child doesn't have a parent, then he's an orphan. And while he may have parental figures or other figures that guide them, I think that the big difference is that those people are there. They're actually present. Like, they're detectable. Like, you can touch them. You can, directly talk with them. We don't have that for God. Like, this situation is just simply not comparable.
Surprisingly, hiddenness does seem to promote relationship with God in the long run. Mystics often report a dark night of the soul in which God's presence is withdrawn from them. But they also report that the dark night eventually ends and that the relationship with God is made all the stronger for it.
And I mean, I guess I really don't understand that. I get that people go through these times where they're doubting their faith or whatnot, and they come out on the other end stronger for it. The way that Cameron portrays it here is that they have this spiritual dryness, or this they feel separated from God or whatever. People who are doubting their faith and then recommit even harder are generally trying to figure it out. And so they try to rationalize it, and they come away with a new understanding that causes them to be all gung-ho for Jesus, or they make a decision to be all gung-ho for Jesus. It's not about God presenting himself to the person or revealing himself to the person in any kind of discernible way. It's all this personal experience thing, like, oh, well, they had a personal experience that convinced them. Okay, so emotional. You're saying that emotional reasons are the reasons why you've recommitted even harder. And that kind of seems to be what most of the time it is. Like, you have some kind of emotional reaction to it, or you have some kind of emotional reason in order to recommit yourself to this religion, and to believe in it even harder. And I find emotional reasoning like that to just be totally unpersuasive. It can cause you to make, bad decisions. How funny would it be for Cameron to be like, some mystics say that they're as dry as Ben Shapiro's wife when it comes to the spirit.
They say it causes them to better appreciate their relationship with God, better understand their dependence on God, and it even aids in purifying themselves for deeper union with God.
So they come away with a deeper appreciation for God. That's kind of interesting, because I kind of feel like if God is so hidden in my life that I'm sitting there questioning whether or not he exists, I don't understand what would cause somebody to then come away with a deeper appreciation for God, especially if you start looking into everything that the Bible claims and how that's wrong. I totally accept that this is just my own bias. I personally don't understand this point, and I'll never be able to understand this point. I'll never be able to understand how you can come away doubting your faith and being even more coupled with your faith, because it doesn't make sense to me in the first place to believe in those things. So I totally get that it's something that I just will never be able to understand. I know that some people are convinced by questioning their religion and then coming away and being even more religious. I get that people do that. I just don't understand.
On the other hand, some non-believers openly claim that if God exists, they wouldn't want a relationship at all, but would instead rebel. It makes sense to think that God might want to remain hidden. And if you want to form a healthy relationship with somebody, doing something that causes them to resent and fight you would be counterproductive. For as long as someone has this disposition, God's purposes might be better served if he remains distant.
Now, I feel like this doesn't exactly work in practice. So in his whole parent-child analogy there, well, it's kind of weird because it's thought of as we're the children of God, we're the child of God or whatever. And of course, Jesus is his son. But also in the Bible, it talks about how we're supposed to marry God. So it's kind of like a weird, hillbilly Alabama type of family dynamic, I guess. There are plenty of reasons why you would want to do something for somebody that they are going to resent that they are going to hate and that they will probably resent you, but you know that it needs to be done for them. Sending somebody to rehab or having an intervention or something like that. Forcing somebody or telling somebody something they need to hear or something that they need to do, even though it's going to make them resent you, is I would think be part of what it means to be a parent, like to be a good parent. Here's an example. My son doesn't want to eat any kind of green food unless he chooses to eat it. And so we have a rule here at our house that he has to eat at least, one green thing for one of his meals. And so he never likes that, but he's accepted it. At first, he really fought us on it, but this is we feel like this is a good compromise, between his mother's house and our house. He doesn't like it and he kind of resents us for it, but it's still a good thing for him. And so if we try to apply this to the divine hiddenness thing, Cameron is saying, well, it might be a good thing not to do, say, or tell a person this thing that they don't want to hear. It might be a good thing for you to just pull back and just let them do what in the fuck ever. Here's the thing about God, though. If God does exist, he would know exactly what kind of evidence would persuade any one person on earth to believe in him. God knows what it would take to convince like me that he exists. And if God does believe in free will, then by God not presenting himself to us or not showing us that he exists in some kind of way, he's removing that ability to use our free will to, worship him. Because while we say, oh, I wouldn't worship that fuck, I mean, we need to be presented with the option first that, oh, this God is definitely the God. Everything in the Bible is true. And then we can make that decision, like saying, oh, well, he said he won't believe in me anyways. Like he won't worship me and suck my dick. So I might as well just stay hidden. I would think that you would need to present like the option to people in order for them to refuse to worship. Now, that being said, I definitely would fall in the camp of somebody that would not worship God, even if he did exist, like the biblical God. I wouldn't worship that fuck. I've read his book. If his book is any kind of indication as to the kind of shithead that he is, no, I'm not going to worship him. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to know that he exists. Why is it that God only wants to present himself to people that are willing to worship him? It comes off actually as saying, oh, well, first you have to believe in him and worship him in order for him to reveal himself to you. Like, you mean I've got to buy all of this shit and worship God in order for God to talk to me? Like, that's some bullshit.
But what about non-believers that don't fit this particular mold? Christianity has always taught that God wants us to relate to God in community, helping one another grow in that relationship. Through activities like studying scriptures together, working on and thinking through rational arguments, encouraging each other in spiritual disciplines, participating in corporate worship, and setting good moral examples for each other, we can help each other learn more about and grow closer to God.
I just have to call bullshit on this whole being a good moral example, and that's how we can know God better. I feel like when people say this kind of shit, that just shows that they haven't actually like read the Old Testament like critically, because there's so many wrong things in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. There's so many wrong things that there's no way that you can think that, oh, if I'm a good person, then I'll know God better. No, if you're a good person, you'll realize that you're far more morally good than this God of the Bible. I mean, that's at least what I came to. I came to the conclusion that like, wow, have you read the Bible? This guy's a dick. There's no way I would do that. So I'll give you some for instances. For instance, I wouldn't sell a woman into being a wife. Like that, I just wouldn't sell people. That's a pretty big one of the Old Testament, is selling people as property, considering other groups of people property. Like all of those things I feel are indications that maybe God is not the moral foundation of our reality or of us or anything like that. And I think that, finding community and doing things like that together, he's talking about non-believers who are not staunchly against worshiping God. Like they are the ones that need to like do Bible study with believers to rationally think out these things with believers. These non-believers need to like go to church so that they can, know God better and all this other stuff. You're basically telling people, well, if you indoctrinate yourself into the faith and you just inundate everything about your day-to-day life with God, then you'll eventually believe. And I would agree. If I sat here and I constantly went to like church or Bible studies with believers, and I was there not to critically think about the material, but to, learn more about God or something, then yeah, I'll eventually be indoctrinated into the faith again. I won't have any kind of problem worshiping that God because I've only been told all of the good shit about God. The problem is that I feel like that's a really bad, sales pitch for your religion, saying that, oh, well, if you'd indoctrinate yourself into the religion, then you'll be happy about it. Okay, that's not going to get me closer to the truth of reality.
This responsibility is extremely valuable. Using it correctly helps us form deeper, more meaningful relationships with God and other people. Unfortunately, we humans often fail in this responsibility. When Christians are intellectually lazy, when they oppress others, when they display bigotry, and when religious leaders manipulate their flocks into believing false things for their own personal gain, this places stumbling blocks in the way of others growing closer to God.
Does Cameron know what the history of Christianity is? Because, he basically just described all of Christian history. Oppressing others, abusing others, teaching doctrines that are personally beneficial to the person preaching them. That's just Christian history. When Christians are intellectually lazy, which seems to be a good number of Christians out there are intellectually lazy as far as critical views of their religion go, and critical views of the evidence for God go. And apparently all of this prevents people from, specifically non-believers, prevents them from believing in their God. Everything that he listed there are things that would push, a non-believer away. But I feel like everything that he described pretty much describes Christianity, especially with, some of the people that I know that Cameron hangs around with, like, Frank Turek. Frank Turek is very anti-LGBTQ community. He's very oppressive when it comes to that, and there are so many Christian ideals out there that are misogynistic and just hateful in general. And Cameron might be, totally against all that. He might be totally against persecuting the LGBTQ community. My guess is that, he's probably a little bit subversive in how he does it. But I'm sure that he doesn't approve of the LGBTQ lifestyle. But I haven't really heard any of his stuff on the LGBTQ community. But it wouldn't surprise me if he thought that it was a bad thing to be part of the community. So, but in any case, all of these things that he lists are things that Christians do pretty regularly. Now, there are progressive Christians out there that are getting better about a lot of these things, like being hateful online, being oppressive, being misogynistic. There are definitely strides being made in the Christian community to be more progressive about those things. But everything that he described in this, I feel like describes Christian history, because Christians have been at the forefront of every single thing he listed. And I'm glad that he's speaking out against it, but he is also speaking out against those things in such a generalized way that you leave it open to interpretation. Christians who are, screaming at LGBTQ persons that they're going to be going to hell, or that, they don't deserve to exist or something like that, they don't see themselves as being oppressive. They don't see themselves as being misogynistic or being hateful or anything like that. They think, and I've heard this from several different kinds of Christians out there, they think that it's actually loving to say, hey, if you don't stop being gay, then you're going to go to hell. You're going to burn there for eternity, and you deserve that kind of punishment for being gay. And so by leaving it kind of open and vague like that, I feel like he's leaving it open to personal interpretation of what he's talking about when he says Christians oppressing other people. I don't think that there's ever been a time when our society has been so open to the fact that the kind of misogyny and persecution of marginalized minorities. We're open to that. Like, we know that's happening. And at the same time, we have such a large group of people that are unabashedly doing those things. Like, they have no remorse for the misogyny and bigotry that they're spreading. They're proud of it. So, I mean, it kind of seems like, you know, at least in the United States, we're living in a society where we know this shit is going on, and yet there are still people that are those kinds of shitheads.
Some cases of hiddenness may ultimately be the result of us letting each other down, abusing a kind of freedom which God gave us for good reasons.
I'm sorry. Nobody on earth is responsible for, you know, God revealing himself. It's God's responsibility to reveal himself. It's not Pastor Jimmy John's down the street. It's not anybody's responsibility. It's just not. It's God's responsibility. It's God's responsibility to not be hidden anymore. It's God's responsibility to let us know that he exists in some kind of way. It's not, you know, one person letting another person down. That's shifting blame onto us. We've already got the Bible that does that enough. We don't need to further exacerbate the problem by saying, oh, well, if God's hidden, that's really your neighbor's fault for not showing you God.
Hiddenness, therefore, rather than making us doubt God's existence, should instead inspire us to grow intellectually, spiritually, and morally, so that we can help others come to better know and love God.
So Cameron has effectively taken the divine hiddenness problem and shifted it from God's responsibility to not be hidden, to be detectable in this reality in some kind of way. And he shifted the blame onto us, onto humans, because we're not doing enough to know God. And then we're also not doing enough to reveal to others that God exists, so that God isn't hidden. I don't understand why you would want to do this, because it's not God's responsibility. Like I said before, it's God's responsibility to be detectable if he exists. And the fact that he's not detectable is not like a strong argument against a general idea of God, but it's definitely a strong argument against a God that supposedly is a personal God that has direct interactions with people in our reality. Like, I feel like then it's a strong argument. But to suggest that we are to deepen our knowledge of God, and also, again, I want to call out this whole bullshit idea of becoming a more morally good person in order to know God. If you become a more morally good person by current societal standards, you are more than 10 times better than the God of the Bible. So if you're better than the God of the Bible, I don't know how becoming a good person or being a good person, continuing to be a good person, I don't see how that allows us to know God better. If by know God better, do you mean like we know how much worse God is? Like, as time progresses and our civilization goes progressively more liberal and more accepting of people and different kinds of people, like the more we move in that direction, do we have a better understanding of how fucked up our past was? Like, is that what you're trying to say here? Or is that what he's trying to say here? Like, I don't know. It bothers me that Cameron is saying that by being a good person will help you to know God better. And I just simply don't think that's the case, like, at all.
Despite these answers, it could be that some cases of hiddenness nonetheless remain mysterious to us. But perhaps this isn't too surprising. After all, God knows vastly more than we do. Just as it isn't surprising if a chess grandmaster makes moves whose rationale we don't see, perhaps it's not too surprising if God does the same. Of course, there are limits to this. If the grandmaster kept losing games, we might wonder if he was really that good after all.
It's not just that God is the grandmaster of chess there is losing games. He's just not even showing up for the game. Like, it's like you're sitting down to play chess and you're waiting on the other person to get there, and everybody's like, oh, he's already here, he's sitting in front of you, and it's like there's nobody there. And so it's like, okay, well, I'm gonna make my move, and then I'll wait for God to make his. And then God never makes his move. I mean, he's just not detectable in any kind of way. How are you supposed to play the fucking chess game like that? Like, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to convince somebody else to get in the chair and make the moves for God? I feel like that's the argument that Cameron is making here in this video, is that, oh, well, it's not God's responsibility to play this chess game. It's actually this guy's responsibility to play the chess game for God, because apparently that's how this shit works. If he's going to make this analogy, you should really compare it in that way, that God is just simply not showing up for the game at all. And it's not like, oh, here's this chess guy and he's making moves that we don't understand, but we see how these moves, come together in the end. The chess player is just not even there. And that's the problem with divine hiddenness. It's the problem with all of this.
But the evidence for theism and the fact that we have plausible explanations for hiddenness in some cases gives us reason to trust in God's goodness, even when we can see God's purposes only dimly.
Trust in God's goodness? Like, when I look at the world and I look at the Bible especially, I don't see goodness. Like, I don't see any kind of goodness in the Bible or in God's inactions or anything that has happened really in the past that we could attribute to God, because there's nothing in the past that can't be more plausibly explained on natural explanations. And I feel like with the way that Cameron's kind of attacking this, he's attributing coincidental things or things that happen by happenstance to God. Like, oh, well, we don't know why this happened, but there's got to be a good reason for it. It kind of seems like that's the direction that he's leaning, because it's like, oh, God's doing all these things and we don't understand why. Like, we don't understand why, kids get cancer. We don't understand why kids are born with genetic diseases. We don't understand why people have to suffer through years and years of different diseases only to die in the end. We don't understand these things, but God knows more than us. He's a smart motherfucker, and so therefore there must be a good reason for it. This kind of reasoning causes you to rationalize horrible things that happen, and it makes you rationalize them into, this is a good thing. I'm never going to be convinced by a faith that causes me to do that. I mean, it's never going to be a good thing that somebody gets raped. It's never going to be a good thing for like a child to die, like in any kind of way. Like, those are never going, like, there's never going to be a good reason for that to happen. If you believe in a faith that causes you to sit there and say that those things are good, or that there's a good reason for these things, I think that you need to reevaluate what you believe in. Because if it's a faith or a religion or any kind of worldview that is any kind of respectable thing that should be believed, it's not going to cause you to rationalize that as good. Now, applying this to my own worldview, as far as like, why do kids get cancer, or why do these bad things happen? In my own worldview, I don't rationalize it as a good thing. That's for damn sure. I don't sit there and be like, oh, it's a good thing that Jimmy was, molested by his priest. Like, I'm never going to say that's a good thing. But what I can acknowledge is that bad shit happens, because that is how reality operates. Reality is amoral. Nature is amoral, meaning that it doesn't have any kind of care at all, let alone for how it affects us on this planet, this blue speck amidst all of this non-living shit. Like, nature doesn't care about how it affects us. So yes, things that are horrible are going to happen, and that's just the way that shit operates. And that I don't mean to be a bit nihilistic about. I'm not really being nihilistic, but I guess I don't mean to be like a Debbie Downer or anything like that about reality. But that is how shit works, and I think the faster you come to that conclusion and you stop trying to rationalize evil shit as good shit, I think that you can come to a better understanding of our reality. And so I don't know. All in all, for this video, I was not convinced by the defense against the divine hiddenness argument. For one thing, it seems to me that he's more or less attacking like this hiddenness in the idea that God doesn't answer prayers or God doesn't stop bad things from happening or something like that. Seems like he's more attacking that rather than like the fact that we don't have any kind of empirical or direct evidence for God. That kind of is good evidence against an Abrahamic God, but it's not good evidence against a general idea of God. He doesn't really seem to be addressing that issue. The fact that we don't have evidence, he seems to be addressing the issue of, well, you know, God doesn't do these things for me, so why should I believe in him? Which is a very niche way to understand the whole hiddenness thing. I believe the divine hiddenness actual argument extends past this. Like, while it does include those inactions or those actions, I feel like the divine hiddenness argument actually expands outward a little bit into just any kind of discernible evidence for God. It doesn't make a lot of sense why God would be absent if he was the Abrahamic version of God. I don't think that Cameron really sufficiently disproved that the divine hiddenness argument is a problem. I think that there's still a problem within Christianity, within all Abrahamic religions, of this hiddenness that seems to be, common of God. And I think until we can actually have some kind of empirical or direct evidence that this God exists, that particular definition of God shouldn't be believed. If you believe in a God that is hidden, that's part of the definition, is that he is hidden, then this isn't going to be a problem. So all in all, not convinced by this video. I do appreciate all of the technical time that went into making it, but I feel like Cameron kind of missed the mark on it a little bit, at least in my understanding of it. But hey, I'm just one asshole on the internet, so I'd really love to hear what y'all think in the comments below. What do you think about Cameron's defense against the divine hiddenness argument? Leave those comments down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like response videos like this. I guess I will see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and all that kind of good shit. Bye, heathens.